Rendering systems. In the early 2000s, we couldn't afford a general-purpose renderer with the broad capabilities of a modern engine. Instead, CPU, GPU, and memory limitations required highly specific solutions to rendering challenges so we could squeeze every bit of performance out of a player's hardware. As a result, Half-Life 2 actually has 3 different rendering engines. One for world geometry, another for outdoor terrain, and a third for dynamic entities like characters and objects. These 3 renderers had to support a complicated matrix of features: collisions, ray traces, decals, offline lighting, visibility calculations, and more. On top of that, each renderer needed to support DirectX 7, 8, and 9. The differences among these DirectX versions were significant, often requiring different data storage and rendering approaches. They even used different programming languages. Altogether, we essentially had 9 different renderers, each needing unique solutions, and getting them all to look consistent was one of the most challenging tech problems we faced during development.
sugárzás szint észlelve.
GPU Wild West. During development, we faced numerous decisions influenced by our choice of minimum spec, the least powerful CPU and GPU combination that would still deliver a good experience for customers. In the early 2000s, there was far more variety among GPUs than today, with wide differences not only in speed, but in fundamental approaches to rendering. But at the time, we had no real data on the hardware our customers were using. What CPUs and GPUs did they have? How much RAM? Which version of Windows? We reached out to Microsoft hoping they might know answers to questions like, how many DX7 cards are in use? Or DX8? Unfortunately, they didn't have the data either. Realizing we were at risk of making bad decisions without these insights, we developed an analysis tool that allowed players to report their hardware specs to us and integrated it into the early version of Steam. The data was so useful that we decided to make it public, launching the Steam Hardware Survey in April 2003. It's been helping us and hopefully other developers make informed decisions ever since.
Dynamic shadows. With a focus on character and physics objects, we felt a dynamic shadow system was necessary to render them all in all their glory. In 2003, GPUs didn't have any dedicated shadow capabilities that they have today, so performance was a tricky problem. Our eventual solution went something like this, running every frame. First, find all the objects that might have shadows in view. Doing this meant figuring out which objects were in the view frustum, or slightly behind it, to catch entities that were off-screen but whose shadows might end up on-screen. Then we'd render a black shadow version of each one of those objects into a single shadow texture. For that render, we'd use the lowest level of detail model for the object to be as fast as possible. Finally, we'd use the shadow texture to draw each of the shadows into the player's view, darkening the already rendered pixels. We carefully cut around each shadow in that shadow texture to ensure that they correctly overlaid each other in the case where multiple shadows overlap. It's neat to look back on how we did these things, but ultimately we're a lot happier today, where GPU hardware makes it a much more straightforward problem.
Headcrab canisters. Used headcrab canisters are seen later in Ravenholm, so we decided to show them here to tell the story of how they're used by the Combine. The story is that the Combine have weaponized Zen fauna to use them against the humans. Burrowed headcrabs was added as a new feature for this section that was expanded into a larger area that is meant to show a citizen shanty that was decimated by the headcrab assault.
Airboat intro. This is where the player gets the first vehicle of the game, the airboat. We wanted to create a safe space for players to practice driving the airboat for as long as they wanted before moving on. The arena is sprinkled with opportunities for jumps and tricks, and we filled the arena with toxic slime to keep players in the airboat longer, while preventing them from leaving the vehicle behind and progressing forward on foot.
Combinatorial shader explosion. Rendering became much more complex during Half-Life 2's development with the addition of hardware shaders, small bits of code controlling how each pixel on a surface should render. In 2003, shaders were far more limited than today. Half-Life 2 era shaders lacked conditionals and had severe code size restrictions. This meant no if-else branching logic to adjust based on different conditions, and no large shaders with broad feature sets. Also, compiling shaders as needed was just too slow to be useful, so we had to pre-compile them. To work within these limits, we had to compute every possible shader combination and store each one individually as its own shader. For example, if a shader affected a surface based on a single light source, we'd need another shader version for 2 lights, another for 3, and so on. And it was combinatorial. If that shader also supported a normal map, we'd need 2 versions per light, one with a normal map and one without. With features like texture blending, vertex tinting, specular highlights, alpha testing, and various other light types, directional, point, and spotlights, our shader count exploded. By release, we had thousands of individual shaders. Shortly after, we released Lost Coast, adding HDR support, which doubled the shader count again. Once compiling shaders on the local developer's machine started taking too long, we switched to distributing the shader compiles over the entire network using VMPI. We also had a dynamic shader compilation mode that was useful for developing shaders that gave fast turnaround at the expense of frame rate hitching when a shader had to be compiled.
Fighting motion sickness. In early playtesting, many players developed motion sickness while driving the airboat. While trying to fix this, we discovered several factors that contributed to it. We found that reducing the intrusion of the airboat into the view helped, so we made several passes on the model to pare it back. Maintaining a consistent frame rate helped as well, so it was important to keep an eye on performance in these sections. However, the single most important factor was eliminating view roll to maintain a more stable horizon no matter what the airboat was doing. One of the programmers on the team was super prone to motion sickness, and they valiantly offered to playtest several times to test our progress towards a solution. I'm pretty sure they threw up at least once after playtesting, and their noble sacrifice was hugely appreciated.